Cordier and Gilles she is more waivers as on Kurive so in aid projects make a massive difference in the lives of communities, individuals, villages, towns and cities. That is why a few years ago I lobbied very hard with the Department of Foreign Affairs here to give funding to a group who are advocating for the rights of an indigenous community in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, a marginalized Guarani community, landless, where children died from malnutrition in the villages, and that advocacy to empower them to fight for their land and justice was vital. But it made an unforgettable impression on me that literally looking across the fields from the village or the shanty towns were the fattest cattle that you will ever see anywhere in the world, and the largest plains of endless acreage of good land and soya growing fields, etc. But children dying beside it. And what that said to me is that aid is vital, but aid is a band-aid on the weeping wounds of poverty, of hunger, of disease and of homelessness. Which is why, despite all the aid, millions of Africans are desperately trying to get to Europe, with hundreds braving the murderous seas and dying every year in order to get there because of the crushing poverty in their societies. And fundamentally, and this is what has to be laid absolutely on the line, international capitalism, dominated by transnational corporations, bear responsibility for this situation. They see the poorest countries as sources of raw material, cheap labour and markets. And the so-called aid agencies of international capitalism, like the World Bank and the IMF in the 1980s and 90s, laid waste to the social infrastructure of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, with pushing the neoliberal agenda of privatisation of social services, etc., as a condition of getting some money. And the EU establishment as well is guilty of huge hypocrisy. It proclaims itself a force for peace and justice in our world, but in its trade policies it does the opposite, forcing the worst features of neoliberal capitalism on many of the poorest countries, where it wants to open up their societies, their economy, to their multinational corporations to flood their goods and destroy the livelihoods of local producers, small businesses, indigenous communities, etc. You cannot have it both ways, pretending to be a friend and giving aid, and at the same time, by the trade policy, devastating in fact the basis of their societies, which is what causes poverty in the first place. I think as well, it is obscene that in the European Union, 50 billion euro is wasted each year on armament, on the armaments industry, on weapons of mass destruction. Thousands of the best minds, scientists, engineers, etc., sitting down full-time to design weapons and planes that will deliver greater weapons to incinerate larger numbers of people over greater distances. That is what the armaments industry is about. And the parties and the groups in the European Union cannot escape this. They do not like, of course, when this is publicised. But the party of the Christian Democrats, so-called, and the party of the European Socialists, so-called, are the ones who have run Europe for decades. They are the ones who are responsible for this wastage on an incredible scale. If those resources, that expertise was diverted to one simple project alone, say, clean drinking water for the world's poor and the hundreds of millions who do not have it, in a year or 2 or 3, that issue could be resolved. But it's a political choice that they represent the transnational corporations, their profit-making desires, rather than fundamentally the poor of the poor. So yes, absolutely, if I'm an MEP, I will canvass for aid, I will savage their cuts. The Greens and Fianna Fáil stand absolutely condemned for the cuts in the budget so far, but relentlessly as well fight to expose the source of this problem and the solution, which is that the resources of the poorest countries and the richest have to be prized from the hands of this grasping minority of corporations, big bankers and so forth, democratically controlled and run by the poor, by working people, by poor peasants, etc. And on that basis, it's undoubtedly the case that there is enough and plenty in our world to create food, shelter, clothes, and peace as well for everybody in our society. That fundamentally is the solution, and that really is what we need to direct our attention towards.